Would your 10-year-ago self respect you today? Would he look at your choices, your boundaries, your stance before life and think, this is a man worth becoming? If the answer bothers you, that already reveals what the real problem is. Self-respect is something that's lost gradually, without us noticing. Jung discovered something disturbing about the human psyche. He realized that most people live divided between two versions of themselves. One they show the world, and another they hide deep in their soul. This division isn't just uncomfortable. It destroys self-respect at its roots. It's a crack in the structure of your identity. Jung called this the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted. The problem is when the mask becomes our only face. Self-respect has nothing to do with inflated self-esteem or cheap arrogance. It's an internal system of personal government. It works through 4 pillars that great thinkers have already mapped. Jung showed how to integrate the rejected parts of yourself. Machiavelli taught how to protect your personal territory with strategic intelligence. Marcus Aurelius developed discipline based on unshakable principles. Nietzsche had the courage to be authentic against all social pressures. These 4 pillars create something powerful when they work together. A man who doesn't need external approval to know who he is, who establishes clear boundaries without unnecessary aggression, who makes decisions based on what he believes, not what others expect. You can spend your entire life being respected by others and still not respect yourself. You can have success, money, recognition, and still feel a deep emptiness when you look in the mirror. This happens because self-respect comes from within. It's built day by day through choices that honor who you really are. If you keep living to please others, you'll die being a stranger to yourself. But if you learn to govern yourself internally, you'll discover something few men find. The peace of one who no longer fears others' judgment because he's already made peace with himself. A man who governs himself internally operates through clear principles and well-defined boundaries. But there's a mistake that destroys this at its foundation. It's so common we don't even notice when we're doing it. Jung observed this pattern in his patients for decades. People who completely lost contact with their authentic nature. They created a socially acceptable version of themselves and began believing this version was real. It happens like this. You learn from childhood that certain parts of you are unacceptable. Your anger, your fears, your most direct impulses, so you hide them. You build a clean, polished personality to show the world. The problem is, this artificial personality requires constant energy to maintain. You smile when you want to explode. You agree when you want to disagree. You help when you'd prefer to refuse. Each time you do this, your true identity gets weaker. The social mask gets stronger, until one day you don't know who you are underneath it anymore. Jung called these rejected parts the shadow. When you reject your shadow, you reject an essential part of yourself. This has 2 devastating consequences. First, you become dependent on external approval. Since your identity is artificial, it needs constant validation from others. Second, you lose the ability to establish real boundaries. Since you don't know who you really are, you don't know what's worth fighting for. Result? You accept treatment you should refuse. You avoid conflicts that would defend your principles. You seek approval from people you don't even respect. Your life becomes a constant performance for an audience that doesn't even matter. The man who does this might even be socially admired, but inside, he knows the truth. He's living a lie, and this lie corrodes self-respect like acid corrodes metal. Slow, silent, but relentless. There's a brutal difference between knowing your dark parts and being dominated by them. Jung realized that the most balanced men weren't those who rejected their shadow. They were those who consciously integrated it. Shadow integration means accepting that you have impulses you'd rather not have. Recognizing that there's anger, envy, fear, and selfishness within you. Not to feed these impulses, but to not be surprised by them. When you deny something exists in you, that something controls you without you realizing it. Jung discovered something fascinating. The men who most hated certain characteristics in others were precisely those who had these characteristics repressed in themselves. The anger you feel toward the arrogant reveals the arrogance you hide. The contempt for the coward exposes the cowardice you deny. This is the mechanics of projection. You throw onto others what you don't accept in yourself. The problem is this makes you predictable. Anyone can manipulate you by touching these blind spots. They just need to awaken in you the characteristic you most deny for you to completely lose control. An integrated man functions differently. He knows he has capacity for both good and evil, for generosity and selfishness, for courage and fear. This awareness doesn't make him worse, it makes him more honest, and men who are honest with themselves are much harder to manipulate. When you accept your shadow, two powerful things happen. First, you stop projecting onto others what you deny in yourself. Second, you gain access to the energy you were spending repressing these parts of you. Repressed anger transforms into healthy assertiveness. Accepted fear becomes intelligent prudence. Recognized selfishness becomes the ability to establish boundaries. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, including the parts you'd prefer to ignore. An individuated man no longer needs others' approval because he's already made peace with himself. He knows exactly what he's capable of, both for good and evil. And this internal clarity is the solid foundation on which true self-respect is built. But knowing yourself is only the first step. You also need to protect this knowledge from external attacks. And here comes wisdom that Machiavelli mastered like no one else. Machiavelli understood a truth most people prefer to ignore. The world is full of people who will constantly test your limits, not because they're necessarily bad, but because it's human nature to explore unprotected territory. If you don't defend your personal space, someone will invade it. If you don't establish clear consequences, someone will cross your boundaries. If you don't show you have teeth, someone will treat you as if you don't. Machiavelli observed this studying politics, but the principle applies to all human relations. In any power dynamic, there's who tests and who gets tested, who establishes the rules and who accepts them, who defines territory and who respects it. Most men fail this basic test. They believe that by being nice and accommodating, they'll earn respect, that by avoiding conflicts, they'll maintain peace, that by giving in today, they'll negotiate better tomorrow. They're completely wrong. Machiavelli knew that respect isn't earned through kindness, but through predictable consequences. People respect what can hurt them if disrespected. It's a natural law. You don't need to be cruel, but you need to be clear about what happens when your limits are crossed. This doesn't mean being aggressive without reason. It means being strategic in protecting your personal territory. Machiavelli distinguished between the lion's strength and the fox's cunning. Sometimes you need to roar to establish dominance. Other times you need to be subtle to maintain control. The man who dominates his personal territory knows exactly when to use each approach. He identifies the right moment to be direct and the right moment to be indirect, the moment to confront and the moment to strategically withdraw, the moment to show strength and the moment to demonstrate flexibility. But there's a fundamental rule Machiavelli never broke. He never let a transgression go unnoticed. Even if he chose not to react immediately, there was always a calculated response. Because he knew that undefended territory is lost territory. When someone disrespects you and there's no consequence, that person learned they can disrespect you with impunity. When you accept inferior treatment once, you're signaling you accept it always. When you don't defend your principles, you're teaching others that your principles are negotiable. Strategic protection of personal territory works through three concrete actions. First, you communicate your limits clearly and directly at the first violation. Second, you apply proportional and immediate consequences when these limits are crossed. Third, you maintain absolute consistency between what you say and what you do. For example, if someone constantly interrupts you, you stop the conversation and say, "I'll speak when you're finished." If the person keeps interrupting, you simply leave the conversation. No drama, no long explanations. The action speaks for itself. A man who strategically protects his personal territory doesn't need to fight constantly. In fact, he fights much less, because people quickly learn where the boundaries are and respect them naturally. And this external respect strengthens his internal self-respect. Knowing yourself and protecting your territory are fundamental, but something crucial is still missing: the internal discipline to act according to your principles, even when it's difficult. And no one mastered this better than Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, but his greatest conquest wasn't territorial, it was internal. He developed a practical system of decision-making that worked regardless of external circumstances. 3 simple questions that guided every choice. First question, is this under my control? If it wasn't, he didn't waste energy worrying. If it was, he moved to the second question. Second question, does this align with my fundamental principles? If it didn't align, the answer was no, regardless of external pressure. If it aligned, he reached the third question. What action honors who I chose to be? Marcus Aurelius applied these 3 questions to everything, from imperial decisions to personal interactions. The consistency created something few men possess: internal predictability. He knew exactly how he would react in any situation because he had clear criteria. This works in practice like this. Someone offends you publicly. First question, is how they act under your control? No. Is how you respond under your control? Yes. Second question, does responding with anger align with your principles? If your principles include dignity and self-control, no. Third question, what action honors who you chose to be? Maybe completely ignoring, maybe a firm but controlled response. This system eliminates impulsiveness. You don't react from emotion. You react from principle. You don't make decisions based on the mood of the moment, but on internal guidelines that don't change. When you act consistently with your principles, you build trust in yourself. Marcus Aurelius called this the inner citadel, a system of personal government that remains unshakable, regardless of external chaos. When you govern your reactions through clear principles, you can face any situation with serenity. The internally disciplined man doesn't need to prove anything to anyone because he's already proven everything to himself. He knows he can count on himself in the most difficult situations, and this unshakable certainty is one of the purest sources of self-respect that exist. But there's still a final challenge: how to maintain this internal integrity without becoming rigid or socially isolated, how to be authentic without being antisocial. And here Nietzsche's wisdom becomes essential. Nietzsche faced a question every conscious man faces sooner or later: how to be true to yourself in a world that constantly pressures you to conform, how to maintain your authenticity without becoming a social outcast. Nietzsche's answer was practical: distinguish between useful conformity and destructive conformity. Useful conformity is following social rules that facilitate coexistence without violating your principles. Destructive conformity is betraying who you are to please others. For example, wearing appropriate clothes for the environment is useful conformity. Pretending to agree with opinions that violate your values is destructive conformity. Being polite to people you don't like is useful conformity. Accepting disrespect to keep the peace is destructive conformity. Nietzsche called this herd mentality, the tendency to follow the crowd not because you agree with the direction, but because it's more comfortable than taking responsibility for your choices. The problem is this prevents you from growing. The solution is to develop what Nietzsche called the free spirit, someone who questions before accepting, who chooses consciously instead of following automatically. This doesn't mean being rebellious for the sake of being rebellious. It means being selective about where to conform and where to resist. Nietzsche knew that being authentic has social costs. Some people will reject you, some groups will exclude you. The question is whether these costs are worth it. For him they were, because the cost of not being authentic was much higher, living a life that wasn't yours. Practical authenticity works like this. You identify your fundamental non-negotiable values. Then you identify where you can be flexible without violating them. When pressure to conform arises, you ask, does this violate my fundamental values? If yes, you resist. If no, you adapt. This requires moral courage, the courage to be misunderstood when necessary, to accept rejection from people whose values don't align with yours, to choose quality over quantity in relationships. The authentic man doesn't need others' approval because he has something more valuable, his own approval. He knows his choices reflect who he really is, not who others want him to be. And this internal coherence is where self-respect finds its purest expression. A man who truly respects himself operates differently. Jung taught him to accept his totality. Machiavelli showed him how to protect boundaries. Marcus Aurelius gave him a decision system. Nietzsche granted him courage to be authentic. Now he has something rare: internal government. This manifests in concrete actions. He doesn't accept constant interruptions without consequence. He doesn't agree with opinions that violate his principles to please. He doesn't seek validation from people whose values he doesn't respect. He doesn't tolerate disrespect disguised as joking. When someone tests his limits, he responds with immediate clarity. When he needs to make a difficult decision, he consults his principles, not the mood of the moment. When social pressures try to make him conform, he distinguishes between useful adaptation and personal betrayal. There's an abyssal difference between seeking respect and respecting yourself. The first lives from outside in, always needing external validation. The second lives from inside out, being his own source of approval. The man who governs himself internally establishes clear standards for himself and for those who want to be part of his life. Not from arrogance, but from clarity. He knows what he's worth and doesn't accept less. This doesn't make him perfect, it makes him honest. Honest about limitations, desires and principles. This radical honesty with himself allows real honesty with others. He doesn't need masks because he's made peace with who he is. Would your 10-year-ago self respect you today? If you apply these 4 pillars, the answer will change, because you won't be the same person anymore. You'll have become the type of man worth being, the type who respects himself. And when you truly respect yourself, everyone notices. If you want to understand even more deeply how to apply these principles in daily life, I'll leave on screen the next video about the practical strategies Machiavelli used to maintain control in extreme pressure situations. It will show you techniques few people know.